Have you ever asked yourself, why are there 4 Gospels? I mean, is it necessary to have 4 accounts of Jesus' life? Like, don't they all tell the same story? And why does one story appear in one account but not in another? Or why is a story told differently in one account than another? Don't these contradictions work against Christianity's claim that the Bible is true? If you have thought about or tried reading the Gospels for more than 10 seconds, you have likely found yourself asking questions like this. Which, by the way, is totally normal because Christians have been asking these same questions since the beginning. As early as the 2nd century, a scholar named Titian wrote the Diatessaron, and this was an attempt to combine all 4 Gospels into a single, coherent narrative of Jesus' life. Lately, though, this approach of smoothing out the rough edges has gone out of style with theologians like Richard Burridge, who says proper study and use of historical research will lead to a better understanding than an uncritical blending which smooths out the distinctive picture of each gospel. In his book, 4 Gospels, One Jesus, Burridge makes the claim that each gospel author is presenting a different portrait or angle of Jesus, and therefore will shape their unique narrative in order to make that point. Let's try an example. If someone were to try and tell the story of my life by only using one picture, then they might very well choose a picture of me on stage preaching to a church. But they also might choose a picture of me with Sweet Bear and buckets. But they also might choose a photo of me running a distance race, or even me cheering for the Bulls. Now, all of these are pictures of me. All of them are true to who I am, but each one is highlighting a different aspect of my personality, my character, and my calling in the world. Yes, it is part of my calling to cheer for the Chicago Bulls. It's a heavy burden to carry right now. This is partly what's going on in the gospel accounts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all telling the story of Jesus, but each author is choosing to highlight a different aspect of who Jesus is in order to show the significance of his life, death, and resurrection. And we read the Gospels well, not when we desperately try to harmonize all of these accounts just to make our contemporary sensibilities feel better, but we read the Gospels well when we seek to understand the unique portrait that each individual author is painting. That's our lesson for today. So let's start with Mark. Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels and is most famous for its furious pace. Jesus does almost no teaching in Mark. Instead, he is depicted as a man of action, moving immediately from place to place constantly. And the timeline of Jesus' ministry is pretty vague throughout the account. Not only is Jesus' timeline a mystery, but his very identity is also uncertain. Rather than just coming out and telling us blatantly, Mark has his characters, and therefore his readers, slowly discover Jesus' identity and the significance of that identity over time. Even the ending of Mark is ambiguous. After the women have encountered the empty tomb, they don't really do anything with the news. And we, as the readers, are left to decide what we're gonna do with the good news of the resurrection. So, when reading Mark, learn to lean into the mystery and the challenge to take ownership over our faith. So, if Mark is mysterious, then Matthew is the exact opposite. While 90% of Mark appears in Matthew, Matthew goes further and gives us a bit of a fuller portrait of Jesus by giving us things like a birth narrative, more resurrection narratives, and much more teaching. Matthew is also considered to be the most Jewish of these accounts. We talked last week about how each of these authors will reference or echo back to the Old Testament in their writing, but Matthew is certainly the most committed to this. Matthew references the Old Testament 3 times more than Mark does. He begins his entire account with a genealogy connecting Jesus to King David. And as we've talked about before, Matthew structures his entire account to mirror the 5 books of the Jewish Torah. Of course, then the great shock of Matthew's gospel is that this Jesus, who came to fulfill the Jewish Old Testament, is rejected by the very Jews he came to save. And so we see Matthew's gospel ending with the resurrected Jesus sending his disciples to the Gentiles to share his good news. So then, when reading Matthew, watch out for Jesus fulfilling the Old Testament. And speaking of those Gentiles, Luke's account, much like Matthew's, is a lot closer in structure to a traditional Greco-Roman biography, with birth narratives, resurrection narratives, and also a lot of teaching. However, while Matthew seemed heavily focused on the Jews, Luke has an altogether different focus: the poor and lowly. After all, Luke is the author that tells us that Jesus' ministry was primarily bankrolled by women. He's the author who gives us 3 parables about lost things in chapter 15 of his account, as well as a shocking parable about a Samaritan who acts more godly and righteous than the chosen priests. All of these stories center around different types of outcasts, and they are all unique to Luke's account. Burridge says that Luke portrays Jesus as concerned for all those bearing burdens, especially those who have none to share the weight: the poor, outcasts, women, and Gentiles. So when reading Luke, watch out for a Jesus who cares deeply for the left out. So these first 3 accounts, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, all have their distinctions, but they're also very similar. Then we get to the Gospel of John, my favorite gospel, for obvious reasons. John's account actually shares very little with the other 3 in terms of word-for-word content. Scholars believe that it was written much later than the other 3, and even its style is more poetic and artistic, inviting the reader into a deeper, more metaphorical understanding of stories like the man born blind in John chapter 9. While this man was physically blind, it was the Pharisees, his neighbors, and even his parents who are spiritually blind to the truth of who Jesus is. This sense of irony and multiple levels of meaning are found all over John's gospel. Rather than starting with Jesus' birth, John goes all the way back to the beginning of creation. And unlike his counterparts, John makes a clear claim from the beginning that Jesus is not just the Messiah of Israel, but God himself in the flesh. This claim of Jesus not only being God's son, but God himself, which is often called Christology, is definitely something to watch out for when reading John's account. So at this point, hopefully, we understand a little bit more about the unique emphasis of each gospel author. But we still have to answer this question of why. How does having 4 accounts help us to understand who Jesus was and how we are to follow him? Well, I think there's 2 things here that we can take away. First, by having 4 accounts, we are, as we said before, given a fuller portrait of who Jesus really was. Rather than just understanding his ministry to the Jews that we see in Matthew, we also see that Jesus had a massive heart for the poor and lowly in Luke. And in John, we see that it is God himself who cares for all of these people. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that none of these 4 accounts could ever fully encapsulate the picture of who Jesus really was. Remember what Mark said, Jesus is a mystery in many ways. But what these 4 accounts do is they provide boundaries for our limited understanding of Jesus to work within. Burridge uses the illustration of a ballpark or a stadium where a game is played. He says this: somewhere in between the 4 boundaries, running around on the field of play, but refusing to be tied down, is the historical Jesus whose character stimulated it all in the first place. At the end of the day, that's part of the main point of studying these texts, is to try as best we can to understand the character of Jesus so that we can imitate him more and more in our everyday lives.